Welcome, everyone, to our 24th Congressional briefing on policy strategies to support children's development, health, and well-being. We so appreciate your interest in this really vital topic, and we're excited to present you with some of the most reputable scientists and practitioners in the field who are discovering the significant effects of modest economic supports on child brain development and the prevention of child maltreatment. There is no issue of greater universal concern or that demands our concerted attention more than the obstacles that prevent our children from developing into healthy, happy, and productive adults. One of the most obvious and prevalent of those obstacles is the very high poverty rate among children in the US. In past years, they are 62% more likely to experience poverty than adults. And yet, although the poverty child rate has been persistently high, there's no long-term national strategy to address child poverty and the negative outcomes associated with it. We know we can do more. When we prioritize our children, it results in lower child poverty rates and improved economic outcomes for all of society. And in fact, we now have evidence to suggest that certain policies at the federal and state level have potential to turn the tide and give all of our children a chance to succeed in life, in particular by providing lower income families with the supports they need to invest in their children's welfare. The cost of not providing for American families is exorbitant in terms of foster care, worker productivity losses, costs to the healthcare and mental health systems, and costs of incarceration and the justice system. All that not to mention the human suffering. But the science is pointing us to policy strategies, and that's what our speakers will present to you today. I'd first like to tell you about our sponsors. We have two sponsors, actually, the National Prevention Science Coalition to Improve Lives, the Frank Porter Graham Child Development Institute at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill, and the Frontier Program, which is in the Child Development Institute. FPG, as we call it, the Child Development Institute, is focused on forming policies and supporting practices that promote child development and educational outcomes for children of all backgrounds. And these are some of the areas that we're invested in. For the National Prevention Science Coalition to Improve Lives, the other sponsor, was a large national professional organization that is committed to translating the knowledge and practices that have been amassed from the prevention sciences into public health policies. And our website is below on this screen. And we are just absolutely delighted that Congresswoman Rosa DeLauro has agreed to speak with you on today's topic. And I will play that video for you now.
This is Congresswoman Rosa DeLauro, representing Connecticut's 3rd Congressional District. Thank you for inviting me to join you for this virtual congressional briefing, Invest in the Future, Policy Strategies that Support Healthy Child Brain Development. I want to recognize today's hosts, Dr. Diana Fishbein and Dr. Melissa Klepper-Faith at the Frank Porter Graham Child Development Institute at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and the National Prevention Science Coalition to Improve Lives. And of course, I must acknowledge all the leading neuroscientists and health economists gathered here today to discuss the impacts of supportive family policy on child development in infancy and early childhood. Elevating research findings and hosting discussions like this so that we can raise awareness about the issues and keep elected officials informed is critical. I am grateful for all you do to address the needs of American families, particularly those in low-income households, so that all our children have the resources and nutrients needed to meet their developmental milestones and succeed in education, relationship, and eventually in the workforce. That is why much of my work focuses on a working family's agenda: universal paid family and medical leave, affordable, quality health care, pay equity, equal pay for equal work, and creating an accessible national child care system for all. These are some of the policies at the center of my fight for children and working families, leading on legislation that years later would become mainstream. And of course, the child tax credit, the most important piece. I've been in this fight for nearly 2 decades, and it has been different than any other legislative fight I have had in the Congress. I was grateful to see it signed into law, the largest tax cut for working families in generations. The Census Bureau just released data that showed the expansions to the child tax credit contribute significantly to a 46% decrease in child poverty since 2020, the largest drop on record. The monthly expanded and improved CTC gave stability to families and to children experiencing poverty and to middle-class families as they tackled the expenses of everyday life and unexpected situations that arose. And no one was more upset than I was when it expired, but I am committed to making it permanent. The child tax credit should be a flagship issue for both parties and the country. Extending it will help families pay for childcare, rent, utilities, gas, food, their children's education, and help people deal with inflation that our country is facing during this cost of living crisis. Thank you again for inviting me to speak today at this virtual congressional briefing. I am thrilled to be your partner in all of these fights, and I look forward to continuing working with you for years to come. Hello, this is
I want to once again thank Congressman DeLauro for that presentation in support of this briefing. I also am going to just mention that our expert testimonies are coming from some of the most prominent investigators, finding some really exciting discoveries having to do with child poverty and the impact on child brain development in particular. And there are also many findings about the impact of it on child maltreatment and the ability to reverse that tendency. And so here are our speakers that somebody else is going to be introducing them in one moment. And some housekeeping from me, who, and by the way, I'm Dr. Diana Fishbein. I forgot to introduce myself, and I'm at the Frank Bergam Child Development Institute at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. And I'm also president, co-director, and founder of the National Prevention Science Coalition. And in that role, I'm responsible for housekeeping. And so I want to mention, only the panelists will see comments that have been submitted into the chat. So it's unfortunately not able to have that kind of interaction with the community of people that have joined us today, but we will be able to see them. So if you have substantive comments and input that you would like to present to us, we will save the chat and look through it later in case there's good input that we can include in our resources page. Also, if you have questions for the speakers, they'll be taken at the end. I can't guarantee that we'll get to all of them, but we are hoping to address several. So please submit them to the Q&A box in your webinar platform, and Dr. Klepper Faith and I will address them and present them to the speakers. And also please note that the briefing and the accompanying resources will appear on our website a few days after the briefing. Usually takes about a week, and you'll be able to go to our website that you can see here on the right and get all of our briefings, including this one, in full. So now I'd like to introduce to you Dr. Melissa Klepper Faith, who's a longstanding pediatrician with a master's in public health and is the Translational Research Program Policy Coordinator at the FPG Child Development Institute.
Thank you, Denny. Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Melissa Klepper Faith, and it's my pleasure to introduce our panelists today. Our first speaker is Dr. Dana Susskind. Dr. Susskind is the founder and the co-director of the TMW Center for Early Learning and Public Health, the director of the Pediatric Cochlear Implant Program, and professor of surgery, pediatrics, and public policy at the University of Chicago. Dr. Susskind has dedicated her research and clinical life to optimizing foundational brain development and preventing early cognitive disparities and their lifelong impact by helping parents leverage their power as brain architects. She is the author of Parent Nation, Unlocking Every Child's Potential, Fulfilling Society's Promise, and 30 Million Words, Building a Child's Brain. Dr. Dana Susskind.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. It is an absolute honor to be here to discuss the many ways in which family support policies have a positive impact on the brain development during infancy and childhood. As mentioned, I'm Dr. Dana Susskind. I'm a pediatric surgeon, social scientist, and director of the TMW Center at the University of Chicago. And I'm excited to share with you some of what I've learned and discovered in my many years as a practicing physician and researcher during the early childhood space. As a pediatric physician and a surgeon, I specialize in giving deaf children cochlear implants, helping them access sound, hearing, and language. But I've always believed that my obligation to my patients doesn't end when the surgery ends. It ends when the patient does well, when they go on to live happier, healthier lives. And when your patients are children, the key to a healthy, happy life is the brain. For me, I first fell in love with the brain in medical school. It is one of the reasons I became a cochlear implant surgeon. Many people think that hearing is all about the ears, but in truth, it is really about the brain. And for me, that became extremely clear early in my practice when I started seeing dramatically different outcomes in my patients after surgery. Some of my patients excelled developmentally, others not at all. Some learned to talk, others did not. Compelled to understand the origins of these differences, and importantly, what I could do to best help my patients, I began a journey far outside the operating room into the world of social sciences. And it is there that I discovered a remarkable body of cutting-edge scientific research that reveals all the ways in which a child's brain is built. I like to say that neuroscience tells us that there are many ways to raise and parent a child, but there is only really one way to build that child's brain, and that's through nurturing interaction and protection from toxic stress. We know this to be true, but there is an alarming disconnect between what we know what children's brains need and what we've actually done to meet those needs. In many ways, we squander the incredible evolutionary gift we are given, a short period of time in which we can set up a child for success in life by nurturing his or her foundational brain development. As all of us know, early in life, babies are essentially helpless. They rely entirely on others to meet their needs. And humans are really unique in that way. After all, a horse fowl is standing within minutes of giving birth and walking within 2 hours. Baby chimpanzees can hold on to their mothers as she jumps from tree limb to tree limb. And a newly hatched sea turtle knows how to find its way from the sand to the sea. It is really quite remarkable. But not our infants. They arrive in the world pretty undone. Newborns can't even hold up their heads for weeks. Walking and eating on their own takes a good year. And unlike those other animals whose brains are almost adult size when they're born, human babies' brains are only a third of their adult size. And those brains, to be clear, are waiting for instructions to guide their foundational formation. And most of that growth will occur during those first 2 years of life. In fact, some 80 to 85% of the physical brain development occurs during this period of time. But for generation, our focus in terms of public attention and money has been on the K-12 space. This means that we've skipped over the earlier phase that is so critical for laying the foundation for learning. Our efforts come too late. Even preschool for all, while incredibly important, is not early enough. And why, you may ask? It's because of something called neuroplasticity, the brain's incredible ability to reorganize itself by forming new neural connections is at its peak from birth to age 3. The development that occurs during this time is breathtaking. Some 1 million new neural connections will form every second. And remarkably, neuroscience has revealed to capitalize on this formative time, what babies need most is rich, nurturing interaction and conversation. This is often what we call serve and return. It's that back and forth that comes naturally with parents and caregivers interacting with their children. We all know it when we see it. This nurturing interaction is powerful enough to help children develop two critical skills. It delivers cognitive skills, the kind found on intelligence and aptitude tests like reading, writing, and numeracy. And it builds non-cognitive or soft skills like grit and resilience. In other words, nurturing interaction in the early years builds the entire brain. So for me, ever since that I noticed the troubling disparities amongst my patients and discovered the literature that I mentioned, I have been motivated by the remarkable growth, opportunity, and risk inherent in the early years. So in 2010, I launched the TMW Center with the goal of helping ensure the healthy development of all children. Brain science pointed the way. Everything that we did and designed was based on the fact that nurturing talk and interaction between caregiver and infant laid the foundation for brain development. It is and always has been about the power of parents and caregivers. My team and I developed evidence-based programs and strategies to show parents the impact of talking and interacting with babies and young children. We demonstrated that all adults, no matter their level of education, wealth, or work, can master the essential techniques for optimally building a child's brain. We conducted numerous studies of our programs. We found that indeed our strategies worked and the science that supports them is solid. The programs we promote can and often do improve the lives of children. But as our research programs took us into more and more families' homes and into their lives, I realized just how much was being asked of parents. Because our studies followed children from their first day of life into kindergarten, my team and I were getting to know many families up close and over time. Parents' enthusiasm was thrilling. They embraced the science with gusto. They wanted what every parent wants, to help their children get off to the best possible start. The problem was that our programs only took parents so far. It became so clear that the larger realities of a family's circumstance, the work constraints, economic stressors, bad luck, or injustices they're subject to, all matter as much as talk and interaction for healthy brain development. They either allow for the brain-building power of talk and interaction to occur, or if they limit the opportunities for interaction, they stifle it like weeds choking off a garden. And once again, I was struck by the alarming disconnect between what we know children's brains need and what we've actually done to meet those needs. Or more accurately, what we've done to allow parents to meet those needs. Because at the very moment when parents and children could use the most support, and when that support would have an outsized influence on strengthening those neural connections, our society largely leaves them on their own. The bottom line is that we've made it difficult for parents to raise children in a way that optimizes their healthy brain development. So for me, the realization that motivated me to write my latest book, and I joke it's the last book, and as I was doing so, I spoke to dozens of parents from all walks of life, and I was struck time and time again by how much they shared in common. Even parents who seemed to have nothing on the surface told me stories and shared thoughts, concerns, and fears that were incredibly similar to one another. Though their circumstances differed wildly, the fact that they were struggling to parent in the way they wanted to, in the way they knew best, that was best for their children, that was universal. I listened to one mother named Jade, who is deeply religious and believes that a mother's place is in the home, as she explained to me through tears that the lack of health insurance and inadequate family income sent her back to work after her kids were born, in spite of her dreams of being stay at home. And I got to know Talia, who had 2 babies while earning a PhD in psychology, but gave up a promising postdoctoral position here at the University of Chicago when it became untenable to manage the demands of job and 2 children under the age of 4. The economics of paying for childcare no longer seemed to make sense, and Talia, in her own words, felt like she was failing in all parts of her life. Unlike Jade, she hoped to work outside the home but could not. We talk a whole lot about parental choice in this country. It's considered sacrosanct, as it should be. But really, what does choice mean when there are no options to be had? Jade didn't feel like she had a choice. Talia didn't feel like she had a choice. And neither do millions of other parents around the country. I suspect that many of you all hear similar stories from families in your states and communities, families who want to give their children the best, strongest possible start, families who are playing by the rules, who are willing to sacrifice anything at all for their children, and yet in many cases are still struggling. And the tragic consequence of this means that their children are not being given every chance to reach their full potentials, to maximize that evolutionary gift of foundational brain development that occurs early in life. Because too often we fail to see the connections between a parent's circumstance and struggles and the impact on their young children and their developing brains. But I am here to tell you that the potential of children depends on the support for their parents. So what does this mean? How can we ensure parents receive the support that they need to allow their children to thrive? Fortunately, neuroscience offers us a roadmap. We can apply what we know about foundational brain development in children to inform a new way of approaching early childhood policy and practice. And what is it that we know? In short, we know that developing children need time, enrichment, and protection. And believe it or not, parents need the exact same thing. Because just as children need time with responsive caregivers to engage in brain building, nurturing interaction, parents need time that allows them to be responsive caregivers. In practice, this means that they need protections like parental leave and sick leave so they can be with their children. Children need enrichment in the form of nurturing talk and interaction. Parents need enrichment in the form of education about their children's development and the support and tools that help them put that knowledge into practice. In practical terms, this means that we should invest in parental education and outreach programs that begin the day a baby is born or even before. And we should ensure access to high quality, affordable childcare for all parents who want or need it. And finally, just as children need protection from toxic stress that can impede their healthy development, parents need protection from the societal and economic forces that impede their ability to parent optimally. Any number of public policies that you'll hear about can afford this type of protection, including, of course, the child tax credit, which I know we'll hear more about today in other people's talks. With neuroscience of early childhood as our guide, I believe that the map for society is clearly marked. If children of all races, ethnicities, and genders are to flourish and grow up to participate equally in the economic and civic life of our nation, society must allow for the healthy brain development from birth. This requires us to treat support for parents not merely as a heartwarming, but an essential, a key driver of how we operate, fuel our economy, elect our officials, democratize opportunity, and carry society forward on our collective shoulders. This is how we grant children the promise of their innate promise. And I thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Zilsky. I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Donald Shepard, who is a professor of the Snyder Institutes for Health Policy at the Heller School at Brandeis University and director of the Institute's group on cost and value. Dr. Shepard is a health economist concerned with maintaining and improving health in the United States and globally. His major concentrations are on cost and cost effectiveness analysis in health, health financing, and performance incentives. Dr. Shepard.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm wearing a tie with Isaac Newton, showing that economists also respect other kinds of scientists. And I'll give an economic perspective on the subject of economic impact of poverty and interventions to address that. So as this slide shows, there are two pathways in which child poverty could address outcomes. The first is the investment pathway that says that poverty undermines parents' ability to procure the goods and services that enhance children's development. And secondly, the stress pathway, that poverty compromises a child's development through exposure to stresses such as family instability, unsafe neighborhoods, under-resourced schools, and other factors. So my presentation will add some data to quantify these linkages and the evidence about the effectiveness of interventions to address those. So the first part, characteristics of children who grew up in poverty compared to adults. This is based on studies that have looked at over a generation from childhood into adulthood. The first part says that children who grow up in poverty tend to be less healthy and thus less productive. As one example, the percent reporting poor health is 13% among children growing up in poverty, compared to only 5% of those who grow up above the poverty line. For women, growing up in poverty may require more government services. So the percent of births that are non-marital is 50% among children who grew up in poverty, compared to only 9% above the poverty line. The need for foster care, for example, is one of many ways in which government has to support stresses that arise from this. For men, also growing up in poverty poses cost to government. The relative likelihood of being arrested for men who grew up below poverty is 2.0 times the rate for men who grew up in poverty, again, entailing costs with the criminal justice system and possibly prisons and jails as a result. Adults who grow up in poverty contribute less to the U.S. economy, on average working 451 hours per year. And so as a result of that, adults who grow up in poverty tend to earn less and thus likely pay fewer taxes, with the earnings per person only half as much or lower for adults who grew up in poverty. So the evidence before showed an association, but there's compelling new evidence from some publications just this year shows that that relationship is causative. The context for that is a long follow-up starting from 1996 of a southeastern U.S. American Indian tribe that implemented a cash transfer program of approximately $5,000 per person for tribal members. Researchers then compared the adults who received that to ones who were statistically matched who did not. And they found that adults who grew up in families that received these cash benefits, cash transfers, experienced substantial long-term benefits compared to matched families who did not receive them. And furthermore, the amount of benefits varied based on the number of family members who are tribal members could be 1, 2, or possibly more. And so the number of years of eligibility varied. So the longer and the larger the transfers, the greater were the benefits that were found. Here's some of the data that came from that study. The number of anxiety symptoms, if they didn't receive the cash transfer, was 1.94 compared to only 0.58. If they did, these are the standard errors. The number of depressive symptoms, similarly, was about twice as much of families who received the cash transfers compared to ones that didn't. And the relative risk here, 0.85 and 0.91, both substantial. Cannabis symptoms, one example of substance abuse problems. The families who did not receive cash transfer there were more symptoms than those who did receive the cash transfer. Receiving the cash transfer results in higher productivity. The orange line, the blue line so low you can't see it on physical health, so dramatically higher for families who receive cash transfers, and adequate financial and employment status that included items such as going to college, not being unemployed, was substantially higher. All of these are statistically significant in the families that received the cash transfer. So there are several policies that have sought to provide support to families. One that was mentioned earlier by Representative DeLauro was the expanded child tax credit that existed in 2021 that provided $3,000 to $3,600 per year for most children under the age of 17. And as she noted, that reduced child poverty by a striking 46% compared to the 2020 level and reached an all-time low. Policy that still has long existed and still continues is the Earned Income Tax Credit that lowers the federal taxes for qualifying low and middle income adults who work, and paid family leave. It's a state level policy, but in many states provides 12 weeks of paid leave to working parents who work. This credit had the benefit that applied to all children, whether or not the poverty worked, and included people who were too poor to work, but the others provide important benefits to segments of families. So to conclude this, adults who grew up in poverty have worse outcomes than ones above poverty. Adults and families who received cash transfers when they were children do better than ones who did not receive them, and the beneficial impact increase with more years of transfers. And public program provides some support, but with the expiration of child tax credit, unfortunately not to the poorest families. And here are the references that will be available in the follow-up. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Shepard. Our next speaker is Dr. Cynthia Rogers. Dr. Rogers is the Director of the Division of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry at Washington University and the Blanche F. Littleton Professor of Psychiatry and Pediatrics. She's also the Director of the Washington University Neonatal Development Research Lab, where her research centers on how adverse exposures like poverty, prematurity, and prenatal substance use affect development across childhood, and how psychosocial stressors may alter the brain and contribute to childhood psychiatric disorders. Dr. Rogers also directs the Washington University Perinatal Behavioral Health Service, which serves prenatal and perinatal women. Dr. Rogers.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm thrilled to have the opportunity today to talk about the relationship between poverty and the vulnerable developing brain. what we know from a lot of research and research that we do in our research group is that a significant amount of brain development occurs during the time of the third trimester. So what you can see here is a 27-week, a 30-week, 34-week gestational brain, and then the brain at birth. And what I think demonstrates this even more impactfully is this movie that takes these images and shows you that during the third trimester, the time of the third trimester, we see that the brain volume doubles. Gray matter volume, which is the part of the brain where the cells reside, quadruples. And this is a time when neurons move to their proper destination. So because of this, because of all of the development that happens during this time, during the third trimester, we see, as mentioned earlier, that the brain is very plastic. And when you have this much development happening, it's more vulnerable to harmful exposures, things like poverty, that can really derail the significant amount of brain development that needs to occur during this time. But there's still a lot of development of the brain that happens after birth. So this is the size of a neonatal brain in an MRI image, about 25% of adult size. But by the time an infant is 1 year old, 12 months of age, a significant amount of brain development has occurred so that the brain is now about 70% of adult size, highlighting again the importance of this postnatal period. Another 10% occurs in the next year of life, where now a 2-year-old's brain is 80% of an adult. And so you can see that it's during these first 2 years of life where we see by far the most significant postnatal brain development. And as was mentioned earlier, that's why these early years prior to preschool are so vital, and why we really feel that a lot of policies need to focus on this early time period to really optimize our children's development. A lot of research has demonstrated that poverty is a major factor altering the developing brain. We know that there are multiple factors that can change how the brain at birth moves down this trajectory to that of the later developing brain. In addition to poverty, there are things like family history or genetics. And what was spoken about before is that we know that poverty can induce a lot of stress, both during the prenatal time point as well as postnatally after the child is born. And all of these things can combine to alter the brain development. We know there's a whole host of things that are wrapped up in the construct of poverty. Being born into poverty or being pregnant during poverty exposes both the pregnancy as well as the developing infant after birth to a lot of different factors that we know can alter the developing brain. There likely are multiple different biological pathways that lead to this alteration in the developing brain. So if we start here on the left, you can see a lot of the prenatal potential biological pathways. And so I won't go into these in depth, but on the right, we also have some of those that are from the postnatal time period. And they really have a lot of similarities in that increasing inflammation, either during pregnancy, and that can get transmitted to the developing fetus, or postnatally, increasing inflammation within the infant themselves. There's also increases in stress hormones that can occur similarly, as well as changes in the maternal gut bacteria that can then get transmitted to the developing infant, both during the pregnancy and at the time of birth, that can alter the developing brain. And lastly, changes in how genes are expressed are another potential biological pathway that explain how poverty can impact the developing brain and alter the trajectory of a child's life. One other way that poverty alters the developing brain, though, is by increasing the risk of preterm birth. And what you can see here in this graph is that those that are in poverty, and that's the blue line, have much higher rates of preterm birth compared to those that are not in poverty. And while initially we did have a very nice decline in preterm birth, More recently, we've seen another increase in prematurity, up to about 10% over the last few years. And so it's another major way in which poverty can impact the developing brain and our child's developmental outcomes. And the reason that is because prematurity itself has profound effects on the developing brain. You can see here in these two MRI images of infants, one who was born full term and another who was born early, but received their MRI at the time that they should have been born. And so what you can see is that even though we took MRI images of these infants around the same time, they're very different. The full-term infant is much larger, has more folding in their brain, which is really important, while the preterm infant is much less developed and looks really immature compared to the full-term brain. And this kind of shows it in 3 dimensions. And you can see that the full-term brain here on the left is nicely folded, while the 5 representative preterm brains that we have there show a significant impairment in the development of the brain in multiple regions. And you can see very easily how the full-term infant is going to end up along a trajectory where they have what is the typical adult brain. But with the preterm infants, it's hard to imagine how they're going to be able to develop in a similar fashion. And so this just highlights again the significant ways in which being born into poverty can disrupt typical brain development. And again, prematurity being a profound way. So we've been studying a cohort of preterm infants and full-term infant comparison group here for about 15 years. And what some of the things that we have found is that the changes that we see in the newborn brain are related to impairments in early child development. So to summarize very briefly, we've seen changes in the structure of the brain. We've seen changes in the function of the brain during the newborn period. And we see that those changes are really associated with impairments in motor skills, social skills, attention, as well as fear and anxiety in those infants at ages 2 years of age, as well as at age 5. And so what we do know is that different than I think what was typically thought of, especially a few decades ago, that the things that happen during infancy or pregnancy don't really impact the developing child because they don't remember them. Well, that's not true. The brain remembers, and they can have a profound impact on the later development of the child. So within our group of preterm infants, we've been studying how poverty might be impacting the developing brain. One of the ways that we've done that is by looking at neighborhood poverty. And so we use this area deprivation index, which really collates a whole host of markers and allows us to gauge the neighborhood that our participants grow up in terms of how much neighborhood poverty exists or doesn't. And so what we've done with this measure is look at how the neighborhood poverty is impacting the developing brain. So this summarizes a lot of different work, but what we have found is that exposure to neighborhood poverty impacts a lot of regions of the brain that we know are really important for social and emotional development, attention, and executive function. And that we know that there are also relationships between neighborhood poverty and those same outcomes. And so because of that, it really does look like, and some of our research has demonstrated, that it is the experience of neighborhood poverty changing the brain that was increasing the symptoms of impairment in the children when they were ages 2 and 5. And so that really demonstrates the impact of poverty, but also an opportunity for intervention at a policy level that would allow our families to be raising their children in areas with more investment. And I should say that in addition to neighborhood poverty, we found similar results when we just look at family income as well. And so we know that the experience of family income is also altering the developing brain and also leading to some of these social emotional deficits that we see. So I will just quickly summarize that we see brain changes, and the brain changes the most during the prenatal period and during the first few years of life. And again, these rapid changes make the brain both more vulnerable, but also it's also a time where we can optimize brain development by providing the things that the developing brain really needs, which my colleague, Dr. Joan Luby, will be discussing in a moment. We also know that exposure to poverty is altering both prenatal and postnatal physiology, both in the caregiver as well as in the infant, explaining some of the ways in which poverty is impacting the developing brain. And we also know that poverty increases the risk for preterm birth. And we know that prematurity increases the risk for impaired social and emotional development, but we also know it's one of the #1 risk factors for intellectual disabilities, motor impairments, and a whole host of other developmental delays that some children face. And so by impacting poverty, we can decrease the rates of preterm birth and really have a significant public health impact on developmental outcomes for children. So with that, I will end. I just want to acknowledge all of the work of our lab. And again, I'm really excited to have had the opportunity to discuss some of these issues with you all today.
Thank you, Dr. Rogers. Our next speaker is Dr. Joan Luby. Dr. Joan Luby is the Samuel and May S. Ludwig Professor of Child Psychiatry at Washington University School of Medicine at St. Louis, and is the founder and the director of the Washington University School of Medicine Early Emotional Development Program. Her research focuses on early experiences in brain development, the effects of poverty on brain development, and sensitive periods in emotion development and therapeutic response. Dr. Luby?
Thank you. It's really an honor to be here today, and I'm excited to add on to the great work that has been presented thus far to talk about how important the early and prenatal environment is to the child's ability to thrive, and really what we need to start focusing on in public policy for our children in the United States that seems very, very achievable, yet somehow has not been achieved. So let's see, I'm having trouble advancing my slides. There we go. To just provide a framework, I think it's important to think about child development as an area where there are certain foundational needs that a child has in order to thrive. They need nurturance and support from an available primary caregiver. They need nutrition and healthy food. They need shelter and protection from danger. And they need to have an environment where they can have sufficient and good quality sleep. And again, children don't need optimal conditions to thrive, but they need a certain base level of protections in order to thrive, essentially a good enough environment. And there's a very sort of cogent parallel to what happens with plants, and that is plants need nutritious soil, they need sunlight, and they need rain in order to thrive. And we know that when they don't have those things, they essentially will wilt. So to talk about some of the data that we've collected along this line, pulling data from a 17-year longitudinal study that we conducted at Washington University, we studied children beginning at age 3 and continued to follow them into early adulthood. And what we found, we were really studying the effects of early mood disorders on neurodevelopment. We had 5 waves of brain scans. We also had very, very careful measures of environment and observational measures of caregiving. And what we found was that the effects of poverty early in life were having a very tangible material impact on key regions of brain development, in particular the hippocampus. And this really wasn't what the study was designed to look at, but we stumbled upon this finding and it was so powerful that we couldn't ignore it. And we began to chase down this signal in this sample after that. And what we also found, looking at the 5 waves of brain scans in this sample, was a very, very powerful relationship between income to needs and subcortical gray matter development, such that children who were living below the poverty line with low income to needs had suboptimal cortical gray matter development. Those who had higher income to needs had somewhat better cortical gray matter development, and those with the highest had the most optimal cortical gray matter development. So what this really shows us is that children's environments, beginning early and across time, was materially impacting the way their brains were developing. And this analysis controls for a bunch of other variables that are known to impact neurodevelopment. The other thing we also found was that one of the mechanisms by which preschool poverty was impacting child brain development was not only through support to stressful life events, as has been talked about by many of our speakers, but also through parenting. That was also mentioned by many of our speakers. So again, underscoring how tremendously important the supportive caregiver is in the healthy neurodevelopment of the child, and how this is particularly critical early in life. So the children who lived in poverty, who had more supportive caregivers, had better brain outcomes, and children who lived in poverty who had less supportive parents had poorer brain outcomes. The other study that recently, that I hope will be published very soon, is a study that was looking at macroeconomic circumstances and how that was affecting brain development. This study used a very large sample that's currently ongoing called the ABCD study, where over 11,000 children have undergone brain scans across 17 states. And what they looked at were cost of living in these various states and poverty mitigation programs, including income tax benefit, Medicaid expansion, et cetera. And they found that there were moderating effects of these macroeconomic factors on the association between poverty and hippocampal volume. So remember, I showed you earlier that exposure to poverty had a very strong impact on the development of the hippocampus in our longitudinal sample. This is a cross-sectional sample that shows us that children who were living in states who had better social supports had less of a relationship between living in poverty and hippocampal volume. So showing on a more macroeconomic level the power of these social supports on childhood brain development. So the theoretical model here, as has been discussed by a number of the speakers, is that there are many psychosocial forces that influence health and development and thriving. People who are living in poverty experience stress and trauma. They experience more adversity. They experience crime. They experience discrimination. This has a negative effect both on the caregiver and directly on the infant brain. But if we can provide social protections like the child tax credit, like other social programmed Medicaid expansion that protects the caregiver and the child in pregnancy and earlier in development, the effects of these forms of adversity are less deleterious and are mitigated on the child brain. Now, one thing to emphasize is that an ongoing study that we are currently conducting called the Early Life Adversity Biological Embedding Study that looks at a sample of pregnant women and then has been following their infants, both developmentally and brain development from birth to age 3, has shown us that there are very powerful effects of poverty and social adversity on the developing fetus in utero, suggesting these programs do need to begin before birth. And this is just one example where adversity experienced during pregnancy was shown to have a powerful effect on both structure, this slide doesn't show it, but also function of the neonatal brain at birth. And Dr. Rogers previously showed just how much neurodevelopment is going on in the third trimester and just how much sensitivity, neural sensitivity there is in that period. This study very strongly suggesting that social protections for pregnant women is very, very important for the neurodevelopment of the child. And then to really start to think about how we can implement this from a sort of mental health and public policy and preventive intervention model. If we think, we know that there are sensitive periods of brain development. Some of them are prenatal, some of them are early in postnatal development, as has been demonstrated. These are times in development when the brain is most influenced by psychosocial experiences, both to the good and to the detriment. So psychosocial adversity might be more damaging at those times, suggesting that we need to protect children at certain key points in development. It also means that those might be periods of time when we need to enhance development. We need to really think about enhancing learning environments at those periods of time, enhancing psychosocial support to optimize development. So these types of prevention programs can be mapped onto neurodevelopment in a more intelligent way by looking at sensitive periods and basically opportunities for protection and neurodevelopmental enhancement. And this is just a slide that's often cited by Nobel Prize winning economist James Heckman, who really sort of, I see this as a illustration of sensitive periods from 20,000 feet, basically showing that interventions that are occurring earlier in life at the preschool period are having much more powerful effects from a cost efficacy point of view, from a capital investment point of view, than interventions that occur later in life. Again, underscoring the importance of sensitive periods and the idea of attending to prenatal and early postnatal development.
Thank you, Dr. Luby. That was fantastic. Before our last speaker, just one quick reminder, if you have any questions, please feel free to submit your questions in the Q&A, and after Dr. Noble's talk, we'll be able to get to some of those questions. I'd like to introduce our last speaker now, Dr. Kimberly Noble. Dr. Noble is a professor of neuroscience and education at Teachers College at Columbia University, and the director of the Neurocognition Early Experience and Development Lab, where she and her team study how socioeconomic inequality relates to children's cognitive, emotional, and brain development. Her work also examines socioeconomic disparities in cognitive development, brain structure and function across infancy, childhood, and adolescence, the modifiable environmental differences that account for disparities, and the ways we might harness this research to inform the design of interventions. Dr. Noble.
Thank you so much for that introduction. All right, so we've heard from just about every speaker today that early experiences shape children's brain development. And in fact, the developing brain is highly sensitive to experience, especially early in childhood. Now, of course, a child's experience varies tremendously as a function of family economic factors. And so for the remainder of today, we're going to talk about how family economic circumstances shape children's brain development. So these are images that were taken using MRI to orient you. This is the front of the brain. This is the back. This is a view along the side surface. Here again, this is the front of the brain. This is the back. And this is a view straight down the middle of the brain. And these are the average images of more than 1,000 children and teens who were recruited from around the United States. And we set out to ask, to what extent would family income be associated with the structure of these children's brains? And here, every point you see in color is a point where higher family income was associated with a larger brain surface, particularly the outer surface of the brain that does most of the cognitive heavy lifting. So not only did we see this link between family income and children's brain structure across nearly the entire surface of the brain, but we saw that it was particularly pronounced in the regions shown here in yellow, known to support early language skills like vocabulary and early literacy, and other areas that are important for regulating behavior. Moreover, this link between family income and children's brain structure was strongest among the most disadvantaged children. So it suggested that dollar for dollar, relatively modest differences in family income were associated with proportionately greater differences in brain structure among children from the poorest families. Now, we might ask, how early do we see this association between family income and early childhood brain development? Now, the images I just showed you were taken using MRI. If you've ever had an MRI, you know it involves lying perfectly still in a dark and noisy tube, which is great for adults and older children. Some professors like Dr. Rogers are able to get very young children in the scanner as well. When we are measuring brain development in very young children in our lab, we use another tool in the toolbox, namely electroencephalography, or EEG, to measure infant brain electrical activity. And these so-called brain waves are important for several reasons. So when we use EEG to measure brain waves, we're measuring the speed of electrical brain activity. Now, we all have some high-speed activity and some lower speed activity, but we care about the relative amounts of these different speeds of electrical brain function. And we care about that, first of all, because we know that as children get older, they tend to have more fast-paced brain activity. Furthermore, because we know that on average, children with more fast-paced brain activity early in childhood tend to go on to score higher on tests of school achievement and other measures of cognitive ability. Now, unfortunately, children facing early adversity, including poverty, often exhibit less fast-paced brain activity than their more fortunate peers. Now, I started out by asking the question, just how early in life might we see these associations between family income and children's brain activity? So a few years ago, we took a look very early in life and recorded EEG among infants who were just a few days old in order to ask whether we saw links between family income and children's brain activity very early in life. And the answer was a resounding no. We found absolutely no evidence for any association between family income and infant brain activity at birth. But subsequently, when we recruited a different sample of infants who were a bit older, between 6 and 12 months of age, we started to see the emergence of these income-related disparities. So specifically, infants from families with higher family income tended to show more of that fast-paced brain activity than infants from more disadvantaged households. So if we're already seeing income-related differences in brain activity towards the end of the first year of life, it begs the question as to whether reducing poverty would make a difference in children's brain development. And that's the basis for the Baby's First Year study. So what's Baby's First Years? It's the first randomized controlled trial of poverty reduction in early childhood. And this is very much a multidisciplinary effort led by a team of economists, social policy experts, psychologists, and neuroscientists. So what are we doing? The study design is actually pretty simple. Back in the spring of 2018, we began recruiting 1,000 mothers living with low income shortly after they gave birth in hospitals around the country. They're from 4 U.S. cities: New York, the Omaha area, the Twin Cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul, and the New Orleans area. And upon enrolling in the study, all of the moms were told that they would receive a monthly unconditional cash gift that they would be free to spend however they would like, no strings attached, for the first several years of their children's lives. But critically, the moms were randomized into one of two groups. So the group that we call the high cash gift group is receiving $333 a month, or $4,000 a year. And the group that we call the low cash gift group is receiving $20 a month, or $240 a year. And those amounts were chosen very carefully. So work by my social science colleagues suggests that an annual income difference of just $4,000 a year has been associated with higher test scores, greater likelihood of being employed and spending time in the labor force as an adult, and even greater health in adulthood. Moreover, we thought that this $4,000 a year annual difference was likely to hold some policy relevance. Now, we started planning the study 10 years ago, long before discussions of the expanded child tax credit, but we nonetheless believed that this amount held relevance in the sense that it was similar in size to other social services and benefits that moms living with low income may qualify for. So by measuring the differential impact of economic resources across these two groups, we'll be able to assess the causal impact of our poverty reduction intervention on children's cognitive, emotional, and brain development in the first few years of life, when we believe that the developing brain is most sensitive to experience. And to date, the Baby's First Year study has put more than $6 million into the pockets of the families in our study. Now, you saw a similar slide earlier by Dr. Shepard. How do we think that these increased economic resources are likely to affect family life? So we've got two main pathways that we've hypothesized. The first we call the increased investment pathway. And that's the idea that with greater economic resources, moms may be able to afford things like books and toys, perhaps higher quality childcare, perhaps better housing in safer neighborhoods. And the other we call the reduced stress pathway. And that's the idea that if moms are less worried about how they're going to make that monthly rent check or keep the lights on, they're more likely to be able to engage with their children in the kinds of warm and nurturing ways that we know are so important for child development. Now, the wonderful thing about money is that it's fungible. It can be used in different ways by different families. So chances are these different pathways operate differently in different families and different households. So although we're measuring investment and stress very carefully as we go along, ultimately our primary outcomes of interest center on the children. Are we actually dispersing this cash? We're dispersing it on a debit card branded the For My Baby card, which we gave to moms right there in the postpartum wards of the hospital and activated it right there. So mom walked out of the hospital with cash on the card in hand. And then each month, first on the day of the child's birthday, and the mom receives an automatic text reminder at the time of the disbursement. Now, these cash gifts have been entirely funded by charitable sources, and to the extent possible, we've worked very hard to ensure that the money from the Baby's First Year study wouldn't count against determining eligibility for other social services and benefits that moms may otherwise qualify for. Okay, so what are we actually seeing? So I'm going to show you in a moment some of the early results after the first year of cash gifts and how have the cash gifts affected children's brain activity. So, quick reminder, past work suggests that kids living in poverty often have less fast-paced brain activity relative to their more fortunate peers. And we care about that because that fast-paced brain activity has been associated with the subsequent development of thinking and learning skills. And so we hypothesized that our poverty reduction intervention might reverse this pattern. Specifically, we wanted to investigate whether the infants of the mothers in the high cash gift group would show more fast-paced brain activity compared to the infants of the mothers in the low cash gift group. And indeed, early on, that's exactly what we're starting to see. So here I'm showing you the average brains of the infants in the high cash gift group, and here the average brains of the infants in the low cash gift group. This is showing you EEG activity on average across the scalp. So if you can imagine someone lying down with their feet into the screen, that's the orientation we're looking at here. And warmer colors means we're seeing more of that speed activity. And so you can clearly see that the infants in the high cash gift group are showing more fast-paced brain activity than the infants in the low cash gift group, and more very fast-paced brain activity than the infants in the low cash gift group. And notably, we see this especially in regions that are known to support the development of subsequent thinking and learning. Now, this finding got a whole lot of attention when it came out earlier this year, including a front page story in the New York Times, but our work is not over yet. So We had a somewhat smaller sample than we had hoped for because of the pandemic, but I'm happy to say that we are in the process of repeating these brain measurements now that these children are a bit older. They're in the process of turning 4, and a larger and longer data collection effort is underway right now so that we're going to be able to investigate whether these changes persist or even grow, and most importantly, translate into cognitive and behavioral differences as well. Nonetheless, even based on this first finding, we feel that the weight of the evidence suggests that reducing poverty may in fact cause changes in children's developing brains in a pattern associated with the subsequent development of thinking and learning. Truly, this is the strongest evidence to date that income may matter in and of itself for brain development. Now, we've been looking at many other outcomes, not just children's brain activity. So to give you a taste of what else we're seeing, the mothers in the high cash gift group report spending more money on books and toys, and report spending more time reading and playing with their infants and toddlers than do the mothers in the low cash gift group. Somewhat surprisingly, we're not yet seeing improvements in maternal mental health or stress, but we're also not seeing differences in employment. So no evidence that mothers in the high cash gift group are choosing to cut back on work at a greater rate. Likewise, the cash gifts have not caused increased spending or use of alcohol or tobacco. So it's our hope that the Baby's First Year study will have the potential to provide evidence of the effects of poverty reduction on the developing child and family life, and in turn to inform debates on the generosity or cuts both to existing as well as new safety net programs. Because while none of us would ever suggest that family income is the only or even the most important factor in shaping children's brain development, it may be uniquely targetable by policy. So on behalf of my co-panelists, many thanks for your attention. If you're interested in more information on our study, I encourage you to check out our website or get on our mailing list. And I believe that we have a bit of time left for questions for the panel.
Yes, we do. Thank you very much, Dr. Noble, and thank you to all of our panelists for your discussions. And we have a number of questions in the Q&A. So I'm going to start by throwing out a question that has been asked by several people, and that has to do with poverty. Specifically, there were questions about the definition of the level of poverty that were used in your studies, particularly in the United States compared to other countries. And also a question about how much influence you saw in neighborhood poverty as opposed to individual or family poverty. But I would like to jump in with that question.
I can start with the definition of poverty. So in our work, we've used the U.S. federal poverty threshold, which is defined based on family composition, so the number of adults and children in the home. It doesn't vary geographically, so there are clear problems with it. So a family of 4 in New York City has the same poverty line set for them as a family of 4 in rural South Dakota. More recently, researchers have developed the supplemental poverty measure to take into account things like cost of living and social service receipt.
In terms of the neighborhood poverty, as I demonstrated in my slide, we used a measure called the Area Deprivation Index, which is freely available from the University of Wisconsin, an online tool that takes into account 17 different neighborhood measures to describe the neighborhood's poverty or lack thereof. And in terms of the comparison between family income to neighborhood poverty, they are often really highly related to each other, which can make it difficult for us to disentangle. But there have been instances in some of our work where neighborhood poverty has been a very strong predictor, sometimes above family income. But in a lot of cases, you really can't tease them apart.
Thank you.
I'd add that the 46% reduction that the Census Bureau reported was based on this supplemental poverty measure of 2020 versus 2021.
So extending from that, there's been some interest in a number of the different questions that have been submitted about the effect of, the social environment, not just income and so forth. And so, the level of nurturing, certainly there are households where there's very a lot of warm parenting, also access to other kinds of programming, and in the schools and in their communities and in daycare. So there's all these different levels of quality of the infant and child's environment, and how is that, either controlled for, or what are the direct impacts of those. And one question, for example, was, when you have a preterm infant, how can that help? How can that level of nurturing help to kind of remediate some of the deficits you might see otherwise?
I guess I can start with a question about prematurity, since that's what our work focuses on. And I should also mention that I clinically see these young, formerly preterm children in clinic as well. I can say that very similar to what Dr. Lupi and others were discussing, that the caregiver still has a lot of impact on the development of a child, even born preterm, as well as access to early intervention services, which are really important during these early years. So that it's not that there's nothing that we can do to improve the outcomes of preterm infants. And certainly those preterm infants that are not born into poverty often have better outcomes because they have access to those resources at higher rates. So I think that the take-home message is that if we can really make a dent in poverty during the prenatal and postnatal period, we will significantly decrease preterm birth. And by doing so, will prevent a lot of poor outcomes in children. And so I think that that's the main message. But having said that, we do know there's a lot of postnatal development that can happen, and there are things that we can do to try to optimize development, even for those that are born prematurely. But again, the focus of the time point for that, it really should be in those early postnatal years, because that's when we can really have the biggest impact on brain development.
Yes, and I suppose that the economic provisions that you've been studying actually help to parents to spend more time with their children, not be as stressed, and provide the kind of nurturing postnatal environment that's needed for the brain to grow more normally. Dana, were you going to say something?
Yeah, no, and I think, with regard to sort of the nurturing environment, I think one of my favorite diagrams is actually one that Kim Noble put in one of her articles that sort of showed the two mechanisms by which poverty impacts the developing brain. And it really works through both nurturing, care, and interaction, and protection from toxic stress. And so it's not so much like dollars or roofs over the head, which are important. They are important, but as they allow the caregiver to provide the nurturing interaction. And, as a physician, for the last 20 plus years, I can tell you that ultimately all parents want the best for their children. They're just given different lots in life in their ability to provide it. But I also want to mention one other powerful piece of evidence that shows you how powerful the brain is. There are a number of studies out there showing individuals literally born with half a brain, right? From all different backgrounds. Literally, they come out because of something that happens in utero with half a brain. And there are studies that show that despite being born with half a brain, because the brain is so powerful, that these children can almost grow up without a deficit. And I think the reason that that's an important point to bring up is that those early years are so powerful in allowing parents and caregivers the access to the resources and the necessary supports to provide that nurturing environment can help obviate and provide a buffer to the forces of this world. So just wanted to add that.
You're on mute, Melissa.
Building on those points about support of parents and how important the role of the parents nurturing is in those early years, we had questions about parenting education, about factors that promote resilience for low-income families, and about how that could be provided. Would that be something that could be provided through healthcare systems, through schools, public health, community organizations? What research is there out there that supports the role of parent education?
I mean, I think that's a really important component, and it is something that should be targeted. But I also think it's really important to consider in the model, parents need a certain level of base resources in order to be able to grow healthy children. You could educate them up the wazoo, but if they don't have basic resources to be able to meet the needs of their child and to be able to manage the stresses of life, that education will not have any traction.
I'm glad Dr. Luby mentioned that, because while optimizing caregiver interaction is, really important and very targetable, we're putting a lot of onus on the caregiver in a situation where we as a society have failed them. And so if they don't have the resources that they need and they're working 2 or 3 jobs, they can't benefit from any sort of in-home parent education that can be provided, through the states. So you do need to allow them the opportunity to have that education by making sure that they're able to meet their basic needs in a way where they can be available. So I think it's important. And when someone is stressed, can't pay the bills, the lights are not on, they can't be their best parent, and they can't benefit from a lot of the interventions that we know can be really helpful, or can't benefit as much as they would otherwise. So I think it's important that that we highlight that.
Anybody else?
No, I'm in complete agreement. I think it's a both and, right? I mean, I think that it's sort of, I make it akin to being a surgeon, right? I go into the operating room, nobody in their right mind would think that I would do it without a nurse, without the support staff, without an anesthesiologist. So I can learn everything that I need in medical school, but if I don't have the right supports, I'm not going to be able to give the child the best outcome. In that same way, yes, parental education is critical for I think it's a universal, right? None of us, we're born loving our children. It doesn't mean that we know the neuroscience. Kim, Joan, Cynthia, everybody on this panel has taught me so much. But at the same time, the support is so critical for allowing that to happen.
We know you're at a hospital. So I'm going to ask this next question that I just think needs to be addressed, and I'm going to just read it because it's important. Have any of the researchers the potential intersectionality and disproportionate impact of poverty and experiences of historically oppressed populations? In other words, or if, for example, research indicating that racism and discrimination in and of itself acts as a toxic stressor, adverse impact on maternal and child health outcomes.
I'm so glad you picked that question to ask, Jenny. I saw that and others similar to it, and I was hoping we would touch on that. Certainly from the perspective of my work, I wouldn't want to suggest that any of us think that income is a panacea, right? Or that poverty in and of itself is the only scourge to fight, right? We know that that's very much not the case. I showed you that somewhat surprising results at the end of my talk, where although we're giving money and we're seeing increased parental investments in children, we're not really yet at least seeing reductions in family stress. And we think that maybe because, right, we're addressing one potential stressor, but these mothers are still dealing with racism and discrimination and concentrated poverty and all kinds of other detrimental circumstances that cash alone won't solve. So is cash necessary? Absolutely. Is it sufficient? No.
I can say for us at WashU, the study that Dr. Luby and I both work on, the ELAB study that she mentioned, is predominantly African-American, and as most of our studies are in our research lab. And we do assess discrimination. And interestingly, it is one of the questionnaires that everybody wants to fill out, indicating that it is likely a significant issue for them. We are studying it in our preterm study. I didn't mention this in the presentations. I was trying to be brief, but preterm birth is more common, particularly among African American and Black patients compared to other ethnicities. And so the intersectionality between that and the poverty that is disproportionately impacting Black and African American families, particularly in our city, likely has something to do with that. And there's interesting research actually showing that it's not just poverty, but it is the experience of racism, that when you query Black mothers, you find that those that have more stress from racism are the ones that have the higher preterm birth rate compared to those who mark themselves as having less concerns about racism. So there's definitely a lot of really important intersectional elements to the work that we do looking at poverty and brain development and outcome. And I am really glad that somebody brought that up.
Well, we're about at time, and I wonder if I could just address one more question. We can certainly continue on as the attendees would like, within reason, not until midnight. But Don, I wonder if I could ask you a question. Somebody has asked, and it's actually kind of a theme in a couple of different questions about why it's so slow, why the translational process from the science, the clinical application to the change in policy might be so slow. And so I would just like to ask you from an economic perspective, what you think might be a compelling, I don't want, argument or position, again, from an economic perspective, to move the science into informed public health policy more expeditiously.
I think what these data show is that there's a reduction, a short-term part of a reduction in government spending. While somebody is still a child, there are a variety of government supports and poverty increases the need for those, such as the need for foster care for families, families not able to fully provide for their children, and then a longer run result, as I showed, of lower income. Politicians and politics is often a short-term process, but I think trying for people and for policymakers to appreciate the longer-term return for that. So economics can show that, as some of our other panelists can show. Individual anecdotes and experiences can further make that a more vivid part for that. I guess another part is to not have a revolution, but to think about incremental changes. So policies that we already have, such as the earned income tax credit, can that be made in a more progressive way so that people that have earned less are still eligible for that benefit. So ways of increasing at the margin, the family leave, a beneficial policy, but funded on payroll taxes. Are there other ways of expanding that that would cover others? Thinking of the example of the COVID, getting a COVID vaccination is a societal benefit. People who are insured can get it through their insurance, but we have a public policy that pays for anybody who wants a COVID vaccine to get it, even if they're not insured. So maybe we could think about ways of expanding some of these policies at the margin that would cover families who desperately need it, but are not often eligible under the policies as they exist after the expiration of the expanded child tax credit.
Right, very, very, very good answer. Thank you, Don.
Welcome.
Does anybody else want to contribute to that? And I think, but because some of the indicators of success of these policies are often seen long-term, and that we see much less service utilization. In other words, fewer people being, tied up in the mental health system and child welfare system and the judicial system and so forth, and educational success, and and productivity loss, and not many people in the workforce, and just so many costs that you see from a generational perspective, that we also need to consider what's been presented today by our speakers, that there are all these proximal indicators, and in other words, there's things that we can observe right now, changes in the brain, changes in the way children are able to meet their developmental milestones and are able to learn and succeed in school, and to develop, pro-social behavior. All of these things are all along that longitudinal pathway to reduction in costs, financial and human costs, right? Later in life. And so that if we can work towards that and appreciate what we see along these pathways and how much we're improving, children's ability to have health and well-being, and also the entire society being economically benefited in so many ways, that could really, be a compelling case for why we need to care for our children. Certainly, caring for our children is a universal need, is a universal concern, right? And so we just need to come up with policies that will help us track our success and our own milestones all along the way.
Just to add to that, I mean, I do think public education is really, really important on a more general basis. So for example, if you were growing crops, you wouldn't plant seeds and not water them. I mean, that would just be really a dumb thing to do. And that's essentially what we're doing to America's children.
And one thing that I've sort of realized is that this feels like this is a very bipartisan issue, right? All parents love their kids, all caregivers love their kids. And I think there's real opportunity in the same way that, back 50 plus years ago, the elderly were the poorest segment of the population. Today it's children under 5. And I've often wondered, we've got a great scientific case. I mean, we can keep doing studies, but I think we know the early years are important. We've got a pretty good economic case, right? We've got businesses who are losing tremendous talent because this is a gender equity, a civil rights issue. So I've often wondered, why not a similar response to as the AARP? Well, we don't have enough time to discuss it. I do wonder, because I think that everybody on this call probably has a child or cares about a child and wants the best for them. They don't vote, but parents, caregivers do.
So we could wrap up. There are a lot of other questions. I think we've addressed some of the major themes, although certainly we haven't gotten to all of them. But this seems like a good place to end. And what I can say is that we will keep everything from the Q&A in the chat, and we will follow up with you as best we can in addressing some of the questions that we weren't able to answer today. Does that seem like a fair closing? And I just so appreciative for all the speakers and bringing your expertise to us. And we will be in touch with all those who attended and registered and weren't able to attend with the briefing recording and resources, and perhaps some additional answers to your questions. So thank you very, very much, all of you.